That's here, confused about autofocus points and zones and autofocus modes. We'll be talking about that today. Let's go. Okay, so this was something that's come up a couple of times that people have asked me, which is regarding autofocus points and if cameras have a certain amount of points, what's the difference and what are the zones and how does that relate to the autofocus modes and stuff like that. So today we're going to cover all the modes and the types of zones which this camera has, in this case the Canon 80D. We're going to go over each one and I'm going to explain what they do. And then at the end of the video, we're going to actually show you some of the pictures that I've taken with different zones so you can see how it affects and how some of the zones affect regarding the photos that I've taken. There's no best one, at least in my opinion. It's whatever you feel that is comfortable for you and whatever works best for you is the mode that I would recommend at the end of this video. Okay, so let's talk about points. Now the cameras have different focus points, and depending on the camera you can have different types of points on the screen. Now you've seen this many times because when you go ahead and hit the shutter button halfway, you'll see the little red dots show up on the screen. That is actually your focus points of the camera locking in onto something to be able to take the photo. As cameras get more advanced, they get more focus points, and not necessarily having more means better, but it does help on locking down to certain things. For example, the older cameras, like the one I used to have, which is the T5i, only had 9 focus points, and this camera, which is the 80D, has 45 focus points. Okay, by default, your camera is going to have the auto mode, which is the one where it selects all the focus points to be able to determine. So we're going to actually go ahead and switch that off and put it onto one of the different modes that we have available for us, which will help you on getting that really nice, good shot. Now there's 2 ways to select the autofocus selection mode. You can either use the button here on the top right, or you can also on the screen, if you got a touch screen, you press the Q button, you can actually select it right here and it'll bring up the same menu. The first one is actually called the single spot, and that is where you actually define exactly where on your screen you want the camera to focus. Many times I usually put the one right down in the middle of the center because that is what I'm focusing on. And sometimes if you want to use some of the other ones because you're trying to do some type of trick shots, you can move this button around. And this usually goes tied together with the metering mode when you use spot metering, because where you define that spot is where the metering when you're using spot metering is going to use. The second one is the zone autofocus, which is the one that I like to use. And in my case, I have 45 focus points on my camera. And what this does, it actually creates a block of dots, in this case 9 dots, and I have 9 different sections that I can move around. Now I like to put it smack in the center and let the camera decide of those 9 dots which is the one that it's best for it to focus. Now in my case, I like to always try to center the stuff in the middle of the frame, but in your case you can probably use different sides of the image to be able to define where you want to put these zone focuses. But again, this is the one that I like to use the most, and like I said, we're going to revise some of the photos at the end so you can see which ones are the best ones that I like and maybe the ones that you use. The third one is a large zone, which is actually consists of splitting up your screen in 3 parts, and it's considered to the left, the center, and to the right. Now this one's a little tricky, and while it sounds cool, it's not my favorite, because what happens is that you're talking about the whole section that the screen has divided, in this case the center, which means that it'll try to focus all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom. Okay, so the last one is actually the auto mode, which is the one where it uses all possible focus points on your screen. Now this is the one that the camera will use by default when you select automatic settings on your camera. For example, when you have your camera on automatic, you won't be able to select the other zones that I've mentioned previously. So note that once you put your camera in automatic, either the one which is like all these settings for sports or HDR, it's going to use the automatic one by default. Okay, now that we've talked about the autofocus selection, let's go ahead and go over the autofocus operation, which I mentioned in some of my other videos. And there's 3 modes that the camera has regardless of the selection that you pick. And the first one is the one shot, which is when you press the shutter button halfway through, it'll go ahead and lock on the subject only once until you release the shutter button or take the photo. And the next one, which I like a lot, is the alt servo, which is where it's going to continuously focus on the subject until you press the button and take the photo. And the middle one, the alt focus, it is one supposedly which just switches among these 2 modes, which I rarely use. But again, alt servo is the one that I use many times when there's stuff like moving castle shows and parades. before I show you the photos, we're actually going to go through some of the settings that the camera has where you can define certain things and tweak the autofocusing system. First one being that damn beep that if you want to turn it off, we're going to show you how to do it. Okay, in order to turn off the beeping sound when we do the autofocus lock, we're going to go here to the menu option. And you're going to make sure that you're on the first item here, which is the little camera, and we're going to make sure we're on number 1, and you'll see it on the third option right here. And if you tap that, you can see that it is enabled or disabled. I like to put disable, and that will kill automatically the beeping sound once the camera locks onto the item. Okay, so we're going to go into some of the tweaks that you can do for the autofocus system, and the way that we do that, we go into the menu and we're going to hit the menu button. And we're going to go to this button over here, and you'll see the second option which says autofocus. We're going to go ahead and hit the set button. It's going to bring up a bunch of options, and we're going to scroll all the way to the right using these arrows keys to number 6. And the first one that we're going to be tinkering with is this one, which it says autofocus assist beam firing, and this will apply only if you have the flash of the camera open. And the first one is enable. What that will do is as soon as you press the shutter button halfway, it's going to actually fire the flash once to try to be able to get the best image possible. And if you don't want that, you can disable it, which is the number 1. And then if you have an external flash on your camera like this, you can actually do the same thing with that, which is where you enable it only to do to flash once before actually taking the photo. Or if you want it just to do the infrared assist beam, which is where you see the little red lines on the people, that's what you can select. Okay, the next one is actually number 7, which is where you can select what happens if it cannot lock a focus, and this usually happens when it's a dark situation and for some reason the camera can't find the lock. You have the option to have it to continue searching, which is my default, or you could put stop focus search, and that usually happens after 2 to 3 seconds. And this is a really cool option that this camera has, because you can actually set it up for have different focus modes depending on how the camera is held. If it's held upwards one way or it's held the other way with the grip up or down. In this case we can have it which is what I'm using. I have the same for both horizontal and vertical, but you can have it that if you press number 1, when you're holding the camera this way, you can have a set of focus points, and if you actually tilt your camera sideways and hit the option to select your focus mode, you can have a totally different selection for one or the other. And that way, if you're tilting the camera around in different directions, you can have different selections that you already have predefined on the camera. That's a pretty cool thing to have, but I usually shoot this way, so I leave it on 0. I'm going to move on to number 12. And this is the one for color tracking, which means when you have an image that has somebody in it, the camera will try to prioritize the skin tones on people's faces to other focus points on the screen. I usually leave this as disabled, since I I do landscape shots and stuff like that. I don't want it to try to go and focus on spots that it's not what I want it to do. So, but again, if you're shooting people and you want it to prioritize on people's faces, you probably want to have this option to enable. Okay, the next one is number 14, which is the autofocus points display, and this is the little red lights that you'll see when you press the shutter button halfway through. In my case, I'm selecting 0 because I want it that even though I'm looking through the screen, I haven't pressed anything, I will see the focus points that I have selected, if it's either the middle, the dot, or whatever. And then once I press it, it's going to actually stay lit. And that way I can see what the camera is focusing on. And you can go here for a couple of other options where you can have it where it just doesn't show the buttons at all. It doesn't show, if you want it to show it only when you press the button down when it finds a lock, you can have it that once it does the lock, it turns off. A couple of options. By default, I leave it on selected constant, which is the default that the camera will have. The next one is number 15, which is the VF display illumination. This is where it actually shows the red light, the dots in red, and this will automatically turn on if the low light is detected. So even though I put this on enable for all situations, I've seen where it only does it where it's dark. So just in case, if you want to turn off the little red dots and have it only black, you can try that, but I recommend that you leave it in auto or enable. Okay, here's one that I took with my T5i, and I select the single point. As you can see, the single point failed. Okay, the next one was actually using all 9 points on the T5i, and you can see where it locked perfectly on Snow White. Now this one's actually some night shots, and this one I like to use single point to make sure it locks on a subject that has light and not something that is dark. And the same for this photo, I actually wanted to make sure that it focuses on the lit bars, and that way the other stuff comes out of focus. Night shot that I took, but since I was at an angle, I actually made the single point to the bottom, that way it would focus on the characters on the stage and not on the castle in the back. Here's your typical shot. In this case, I actually set it to the center zone to make sure that Walt and Mickey are in perfect focus. Okay, another night shot. As you can see where I'm using spot mode right in the center, that way it gets what is actually lit. Okay, this is a Festival Fantasy shot, which is usually my typically go-to settings, which is the all servo mode, which focuses on what is moving, and using the zone, which is the center, in this case the dragon. Okay, in the case of the characters, you can see here I'm using the one shot, not all servo, because these characters are not moving, but I'm using the zone, which will focus on the center of the image which the characters are posing for me. Okay guys, so that's it, the video here explaining about out of focus zones and out of focus points and modes and all that fun stuff. Hopefully this clears up any question that you may had, and hopefully it'll help you on getting those really cool, crisp, clear shots that you're trying to achieve. Now again, I'm shooting here from my home thanks to the COVID-19, and hopefully everybody out there is staying safe. And if this is the first time watching these videos, my name is Dizzy Nuts, and I do videos about photography, and we do food reviews as well with my wife. So if you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit the subscribe button and bell to get notified. Until then guys, stay awesome. See ya.